be honest. There was a group at UC Davis that had some grants and were studying this, but basically, sugar had kind of escaped a lot of people's thinking in terms of being a cause of gout, for example, but also even as a cause of obesity. It was sort of suppressed at that point. And, uh, and so we started doing studies to try to understand how fructose could cause metabolic syndrome and what was the role of uric acid. Because, I mean, everybody was saying that the reason you got fat was because you were eating too many calories and you're eating too much sugar. And uric acid is a metabolite, but it's like an offshoot metabolite. It's not like part of the fructose metabolism in the standard sense. And it isn't like fructose is broken down to uric acid. What happens is that fructose consumes a little bit of ATP, and when it does, that degraded ATP turns into uric acid. So it's like a completely different pathway. So suddenly we started thinking, my God, fructose is actually playing a role in metabolic syndrome, and uric acid's somehow driving part of it. So then the question was, how was the uric acid working? Because we didn't think it was just through the renin-angiotensin system, but we knew that it inhibited nitric oxide. And I was aware that mice that had endothelial nitric oxide knocked out developed features of metabolic syndrome. And so it's called the eNOS knockout. But basically, if a mouse doesn't make enough nitric oxide, they can develop features of metabolic syndrome. So we thought, wow, maybe that's how it's working. And as you probably, I'm sure, know, nitric oxide, one of the ways that glucose is taken up in muscle, part of it requires a little bit of vasodilation, and the blood vessels have to be, dilate a little bit to help deliver the glucose to the muscle. And if you just inhibit that component, that can cause a little bit of insulin resistance. And so we actually did some studies like this, and so we found that insulin can stimulate nitric oxide in endothelial cells, but when we treated them with uric acid, it blocked the nitric oxide production. And so we began to realize that it could partly involve this pathway. But actually it turned out that it was a much bigger pathway than we had imagined. But when we first started, we thought it was just nitric oxide.
But going back to 2003, early in the day, that was a time when fructose was the safer sugar because fructose did not immediately increase insulin. Didn't require insulin for its metabolism. And it was, dare I say, even promoted by groups interested in giving information to diabetics. But the messaging was that fructose is the safer sugar.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. So when, table sugar consists of both glucose and fructose bound together. And the glucose, of course, stimulates insulin, and insulin can drive fat production. So there was a lot of thinking that the glucose component of sugar was the bad guy. And fructose actually doesn't stimulate insulin. And when you give fructose to an animal or to a human, glucose goes up a little bit, but it can often be delayed, and it's not very much. And so it's actually what we call a low glycemic carbohydrate. So the fact that it's low glycemic and it didn't stimulate insulin, it was sort of surprising that it might actually have a role in diabetes, because it seemed like it should be a safe sugar for diabetes. But when you give fructose to animals, over time they become severely insulin resistant. They become resistant to the effects of insulin, and the glucose levels go up. And so you end up with a high insulin, high glucose state when you chronically feed an animal fructose. But if you just give it a single dose, neither glucose goes up or insulin goes up. So it's a little bit of a paradox.